Imagine a device so advanced that when scientists first examined it, they refused to believe it was real. A machine with dozens of precision-cut bronze gears, built more than 2,000 years ago, that could predict eclipses, track the wandering planets across the sky, and count down the years to the next Olympic Games. A machine so sophisticated that nothing like it would appear again for over 1,000 years. This is not science fiction. This is not a hoax. This is the Antikythera Mechanism, and it was pulled from the bottom of the Mediterranean Sea by men who had no idea what they were holding. Today, we are going to tell its complete story. The story of a shipwreck, a lump of corroded bronze, a century of scientific detective work, and a revelation that forced historians to rewrite everything they thought they knew about the ancient world. Stay with me, because by the end of this journey, you will never look at the ancient Greeks the same way again. Our story begins not with scientists, but with sponge divers. It is the spring of the year 1900. Two small boats are sailing home to the Greek island of Symi. On board are teams of divers led by Captain Dimitrios Kontos. These men make their living in one of the most dangerous professions on Earth. They descend into deep water, wearing heavy canvas suits and copper helmets, breathing air pumped down through a hose, walking the seafloor in search of sponges. The work kills men regularly. Divers die from drowning, from equipment failure, and from a mysterious agony they call the bends, which we now know is decompression sickness. These are hard men who understand risk. On their way back from the sponge grounds off North Africa, a storm forces them to take shelter. They anchor in the lee of a small, rocky, almost barren island called Antikythera. It sits in the channel between Crete and the Peloponnese, a lonely outpost in one of the busiest shipping lanes of the ancient world. When the storm passes, the divers decide to look for sponges in the local waters. Why waste the stop? A diver named Valerios Stais suits up, climbs over the side, and sinks into the blue. He descends to a depth of about 45 meters, roughly 150 feet. And there, on the sloping seafloor, he sees something that terrifies him. He signals frantically to be pulled up. When his helmet comes off, he is babbling. He tells the crew he has seen a heap of dead bodies. Naked men and horses, he says, rotting on the bottom of the sea. Corpses everywhere. Captain Kontos is skeptical. Perhaps the young man has had too much carbon dioxide in his helmet. Perhaps the depth has confused his mind. So the captain puts on the diving suit himself and goes down to see with his own eyes. When he returns to the surface, he is carrying proof. In his hand is a bronze arm. Not the arm of a corpse, the arm of a statue. What Stais had seen was not a field of bodies. It was the cargo of an ancient shipwreck scattered across the sea floor. Marble and bronze statues, eroded by 2,000 years of seawater, lying in the gloom like the dead. The divers had stumbled upon one of the richest ancient wrecks ever discovered. Now, the divers faced a choice. They could have quietly looted the site and sold the treasures piece by piece on the black market. Instead, they did something remarkable. They sailed to Athens and reported the discovery to the Greek government. Professor Antonios Oikonomou of the University of Athens helped connect them with the Ministry of Education. A deal was struck. The sponge divers would salvage the wreck under government supervision, with the Hellenic Navy providing support ships, and they would be paid for what they recovered. It became, in effect, the first major underwater archaeology operation in history. The salvage began in November of 1900 and continued into the summer of 1901. It was brutal, dangerous work. Remember, these men had no modern understanding of dive tables or decompression. At 45 meters, a diver in that era could safely work for only a few minutes at a time. They went down again and again, day after day, hauling up marble statues, bronze figures, glassware, jewelry, coins, and amphorae. The price they paid was terrible. One diver, Yorgos Kritikos, died of the bends. Two others were paralyzed for life. Every object in the Antikythera collection was bought with human suffering. And what objects they were! The divers recovered one of the finest ancient bronzes ever found, a statue of a young man, perhaps a hero or a god, now called the Antikythera Youth. They brought up the haunting bronze head of a bearded philosopher, his face so vivid and individual that he seems ready to speak. They recovered marble statues of horses, of Hercules, of Odysseus. Some marbles were perfectly preserved where they had been buried in sediment, while the exposed parts had been eaten away by marine organisms, creating eerie, half-dissolved figures. The finds filled the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. Newspapers celebrated. Greece had recovered a piece of its glorious past. And in the middle of all this treasure, almost unnoticed, the divers also brought up a few lumps of corroded bronze. Shapeless, crusted, unimpressive. Green with corrosion and stuck together with calcified sediment. Next to the gleaming statues, these fragments looked like junk. They were cataloged and set aside. Nobody paid them any attention. For months, the most important object from the wreck, arguably one of the most important objects ever recovered from the ancient world, sat in a crate, ignored. Then, on the 17th of May, 1902, everything changed. An archaeologist and former Minister of Education named Valerios Stais was examining materials from the wreck at the museum. The story goes that one of the bronze lumps had split open, perhaps as it dried out after 2 millennia underwater. Stais looked at the broken surface and saw something impossible. Embedded in the corroded mass was a gear wheel, a precisely cut bronze gear with small triangular teeth. And there was writing, tiny Greek letters engraved into bronze plates. Understand what this meant. In 1902, the accepted view of ancient technology was clear. The Greeks were brilliant philosophers, mathematicians, sculptors, and architects. But precision gearing? Complex machinery? That belonged to the age of clockwork, which began in medieval Europe more than 1,000 years after this ship sank. A geared mechanism from ancient Greece was, according to everything historians believed, simply impossible. Stais suggested the object might be some kind of astronomical clock. The reaction from the scholarly community was swift and dismissive. Many experts declared that the fragments must be from a much later device that had somehow fallen onto the wreck site centuries afterward. Perhaps a medieval astrolabe dropped from a passing ship, coincidentally landing among ancient statues. The idea that this machine was contemporary with the wreck was, to them, absurd. Too advanced, too anachronistic. The lump of bronze was an embarrassment, an anomaly that didn't fit, and the scientific community did what communities often do with anomalies that don't fit. They largely ignored it. But not everyone ignored it. A German philologist named Albert Rehm studied the inscriptions in the early 20th century and made crucial observations. He read words on the fragments that were unmistakably astronomical. He identified a reference to Venus. He began to suspect that this was not a navigational instrument, as some proposed, but something far stranger, a machine for calculating the movements of the heavens. Rehm's insights were ahead of his time, and like the mechanism itself, they were largely forgotten for decades. The fragments sat in the museum through 2 world wars. Occasionally, a researcher would examine them and propose a theory. An astrolabe, said some. A navigational device, said others. A planetarium, suggested a few. But without a way to see inside the corroded mass, all anyone could do was guess. The man who changed everything arrived in Athens in the 1950s. His name was Derek de Solla Price. He was a British physicist who had turned to the history of science, and he would eventually become a professor at Yale University. Price was fascinated by the history of scientific instruments, and when he encountered the Antikythera fragments, he recognized that they represented a profound mystery. In 1959, he published an article in Scientific American with a title that captured the astonishment perfectly. He called it, An Ancient Greek Computer. Price studied the visible gears, the inscriptions, the scales and pointers, and he argued forcefully that this was a genuine ancient Greek device, a machine for calculating astronomical positions. He noted that on the front of the mechanism there had been a large dial marked with the days of the year and the signs of the zodiac. He proposed that turning a handle on the side would have driven pointers showing the positions of the sun and moon. This was, he wrote, like finding a jet plane in the tomb of Tutankhamun. The comparison stuck, and it wasn't entirely an exaggeration. But Price faced the same wall as everyone before him. The mechanism's secrets were locked inside solid corrosion. He could see perhaps a couple of dozen gears in the fragments, but he could not count their teeth precisely. And without tooth counts, he could not determine what the machine actually calculated. The number of teeth on each gear is everything. Gearing is mathematics made physical. A gear with 38 teeth driving a gear with 19 teeth doubles the speed of rotation. Chain enough gears together in the right ratios, and you can make a pointer turn at exactly the speed of the moon through the zodiac, or the sun, or anything else you can express as a ratio of whole numbers. To understand the mechanism, Price needed to see inside it. The breakthrough came in 1971, and it came from radiation. Price teamed up with a Greek physicist named Charalampos Karakalos, who had access to X-ray and gamma-ray equipment. Together with Karakalos' wife Emily, who painstakingly counted gear teeth on the radiographic images, they photographed the fragments with penetrating radiation. For the first time in 2,000 years, human eyes saw the hidden interior of the Antikythera Mechanism. The images revealed a mechanical marvel. Layer upon layer of gears, sandwiched together, far more than anyone had seen from the outside. Price identified 27 gears in the main fragment alone and estimated the complete machine had contained at least 30. And now the tooth counts began to tell their story. One number leaped out immediately. A large gear appeared to have 223 teeth. Another count suggested 127 teeth on a different wheel. These are not random numbers. To an astronomer, they are like signatures. The number 223 is the number of lunar months in the Saros cycle, the ancient period used to predict eclipses. And 127 is half of 254, the number of times the moon circles the zodiac in 19 years. 19 years. The Metonic cycle. The great calendar cycle of the ancient world. Let me pause and explain these cycles, because they are the beating heart of this entire story. The ancient world lived by two clocks in the sky, the sun and the moon. The sun defines the year, the cycle of seasons, the time for planting and harvest. The moon defines the month, from new moon to full moon and back, about 29.5 days. The problem is that these two clocks do not divide evenly into each other. A solar year contains about 12 lunar months plus roughly 11 extra days. Any calendar based on the moon drifts against the seasons. This was a genuine practical crisis for ancient societies, because religious festivals were set by the moon, but agriculture followed the sun. The solution was discovered by Babylonian astronomers and named in Greece after the astronomer Meton of Athens. It turns out that 19 solar years contain almost exactly 235 lunar months. The match is astonishingly close, off by only a few hours across 19 years. So if you create a 19-year calendar cycle with 12 years of 12 months and 7 years of 13 months, your lunar calendar stays locked to the seasons. This is the Metonic cycle, and it was one of the great intellectual achievements of ancient astronomy. The other great cycle, the Saros, is even more remarkable. Babylonian priests had watched the sky for centuries, recording eclipses on clay tablets, generation after generation. Buried in those records was a pattern. If an eclipse occurs on a certain day, then 223 lunar months later, about 18 years and 11 days, a very similar eclipse will occur. The geometry of the sun, moon, and earth nearly repeats. With this cycle, you could predict eclipses without understanding anything about orbital mechanics. You just needed the records and the count. For ancient peoples, eclipses were omens of the highest significance, moments when the sky itself seemed to break. The power to predict them was the power to predict the future. So when Price saw gears with 223 teeth and 127 teeth, he understood that this machine was built around the deepest astronomical knowledge of its age. In 1974, he published his great work, a monograph called Gears from the Greeks. In it, he reconstructed the mechanism as a cylindrical computer, turned the input, and gear trains calculated the relationship between the solar year and the lunar month. Price also made a claim that was hard for many to accept. He argued that the mechanism used a differential gear, an arrangement that can subtract one rotation from another to display the phase of the moon. A differential gear in ancient Greece. This is a component we associate with automobiles. Price believed the Greeks had it 2,000 years ago. Price died in 1983, and he died believing the mechanism still held secrets. He was right. In fact, his reconstruction, brilliant as it was, contained significant errors, and the true nature of the machine was even more spectacular than he imagined. The next hero of our story could not be more different from a Yale professor. Michael Wright was a curator at the Science Museum in London, a specialist in mechanical engineering with a craftsman's hands and an obsessive's patience. In the 1980s and 90s, Wright decided to check Price's work, and he did it in the most direct way possible. Working with an Australian scholar named Alan Bromley, he brought an improved X-ray technique to Athens. They used linear tomography, a method that allows you to focus on a single thin slice inside an object, layer by layer. Where Price's radiographs had shown all the gears superimposed in a confusing jumble, Wright could separate them, gear by gear, layer by layer. Wright spent years on this work, much of it unpaid, much of it in his own workshop at home, and he made discoveries that transformed our understanding. He showed that Price's differential gear reconstruction was wrong, but what he found in its place was equally stunning. He identified an epicyclic gear train, gears mounted on other gears, wheels riding on wheels, and he proposed something bold. He argued that the front of the mechanism was a planetarium. He believed the machine had displayed not just the sun and moon, but all 5 planets known to the ancients: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Their positions calculated mechanically and displayed with pointers on the front dial. Wright even built a working model with his own hands to prove such a thing was mechanically possible. It was a masterpiece of experimental archaeology. Meanwhile, the dawn of the 21st century brought new tools and a new team. In the early 2000s, an unlikely group came together. Mike Edmonds, an astrophysicist at Cardiff University. Tony Freeth, a mathematician turned filmmaker who would become the driving force of the project. Greek scholars including Yannis Bitsakis and Agamemnon Seleucus. Astronomer John Cyrudakis and physicist Xenophon Moussis. They formed the Antikythera Mechanism research project, and they secured the cooperation of the National Archaeological Museum for a new investigation with 2 revolutionary technologies. The first was microfocus computed tomography. A company called X-Tech Systems, led by Roger Hadland, had developed an extremely powerful X-ray machine capable of imaging fine detail through solid metal. The machine, called the Blade Runner, weighed many tons. Since the fragments were far too precious to leave Athens, the 8-ton scanner was shipped to Greece. In the autumn of 2005, it began scanning the fragments, producing full 3-dimensional X-ray reconstructions of their interiors at resolutions finer than a human hair. The second technology came from Hewlett-Packard. A team led by Tom Maldsbender brought a technique called polynomial texture mapping, or reflectance transformation imaging. The idea is elegant. You photograph an object many times from a fixed camera position, but with light coming from a different angle in each shot. Software then combines the images, letting a researcher move a virtual light source across the surface. Faint scratches and worn engravings that are invisible in ordinary light suddenly leap out in raking illumination. The results were beyond anyone's hopes. The CT scans did something almost miraculous. Inside the corroded fragments, hidden between layers of bronze, they revealed text. Thousands of Greek characters that no human eye had seen for more than 2,000 years, preserved in the corrosion products of plates that had been crushed together. The mechanism, it turned out, was covered in writing. Its front and back plates carried extensive inscriptions, and researchers soon realized what they were reading. It was a user's manual. An instruction text, engraved on the machine itself, explaining its displays and the astronomical cycles behind them. The total known text grew from under 1,000 legible characters to more than 3,000, and the count has continued to rise. In November of 2006, the project published its findings in the journal Nature, and the world's press erupted. Let me now describe for you what the research revealed. Let me show you, piece by piece, what the Antikythera Mechanism actually was. Picture a wooden case about the size of a large shoebox or a thick dictionary, roughly 34 centimeters tall, 18 wide, and perhaps 9 deep. On the front, a large bronze dial with 2 concentric rings. The outer ring shows the 365 days of the Egyptian calendar year, which Greek astronomers used because of its perfect regularity. This ring could be lifted and rotated to adjust for the leap year drift. The inner ring shows the zodiac, the 12 constellations along the sun's annual path, each divided into 30 degrees. Around this dial, pointers moved. One carried a little golden sphere, representing the sun. Another carried the moon, and here is a detail of pure genius. The moon pointer carried a small ball, half silvered and half black, which rotated as it traveled, showing the phase of the moon: new moon, crescent, full moon, waning. A tiny mechanical moon that waxed and waned exactly in step with the real one. On the side of the case was a handle or knob. Turn it and the entire mechanism whirred into motion. Time itself under your fingers. Turn it forward and you fast forward the cosmos. Days, months, years spin past. Turn it backward and time reverses. The moon's phases run backward. Eclipses unhappen. With this handle, a Greek 2,000 years ago could travel through time, forward to see what the sky would do next year, or backward to check the heavens on the day of his birth. Also on the front plate, surrounding the main dial, was the parapegma, a star calendar. Inscribed text keyed to the zodiac dial announced the annual events of the sky: the rising of Arcturus, the setting of the Pleiades, the appearance of Sirius. For an ancient farmer or sailor, these star risings were the true calendar of practical life, and the mechanism tracked them all. Now walk around to the back of the case. Here are 2 large spiral dials, one above the other, each shaped like a coiled snake, with a pointer that follows the groove of the spiral outward, like a record player needle in reverse. The upper spiral is the Metonic calendar. Its groove makes 5 turns, divided into 235 cells, one for each lunar month of the 19-year cycle. Each cell carries the name of a month. And here is a fascinating detail. The month names are not from Athens. They belong to a calendar used in Corinth and its colonies, a clue we will return to because it may tell us where this machine was made and for whom. Inside the Metonic spiral sit 2 smaller subsidiary dials. One shows the Callipic cycle, a refinement of the Metonic cycle spanning 76 years, which corrects the small residual error. Think about that. The makers of this machine cared about a discrepancy of a few hours across 19 years, and they built a correction dial for it. The other small dial, discovered by the research project and announced in 2008, stunned everyone. It is marked with names: Olympia, Nemea, Isthmia, Pythia. These are the great athletic festivals of Greece. This dial is a 4-year counter for the Pan-Hellenic Games. The mechanism told its owner when the next Olympics would be held. In the middle of this transcendent astronomical computer, the builders included what is essentially a sports schedule. Nothing could be more Greek. It reminds us that this machine was not just about mathematics. It was about the rhythm of Greek civilization itself, in which the games were sacred events that marked time for the entire Hellenic world. The lower spiral on the back is the eclipse predictor, and it may be the most dramatic function of all. Its groove makes 4 turns divided into 223 cells, one for each lunar month of the Saros cycle. Most cells are empty, but scattered around the spiral, certain cells carry glyphs, small clusters of Greek letters. A sigma, from the Greek word selene, the moon, means a lunar eclipse is possible that month. An eta, from Helios, the sun, means a solar eclipse is possible. Some glyphs carry both, and the glyphs include index letters pointing to inscriptions with further details, including predictions of the eclipse's time of day. Inside the Saros spiral sits another small dial, the exoligmos dial, which handles a subtle problem. The Saros cycle is not a whole number of days. It runs 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. Those extra 8 hours mean each successive eclipse in the cycle happens a third of a day later. The exoligmos dial tells the user how many hours to add to the predicted eclipse times, 0, 8, or 16, depending on where you are in the triple Saros period of 54 years. This is not a toy. This is rigorous, working astronomy, engineered in bronze. But the deepest wonder lies hidden in the gear train itself, and it concerns the moon. The moon does not move across the sky at a constant speed. Its orbit is elliptical, so it travels faster when it is closer to Earth and slower when it is farther away. Ancient astronomers knew this. They could see it in their observations. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century before our era, modeled this lunar anomaly mathematically. And the makers of the Antikythera Mechanism built Hipparchus's theory into metal. Here is how they did it, and I want you to appreciate the sheer elegance of this solution. Deep in the mechanism, there is a pair of gears mounted one behind the other on slightly offset axes. The rear gear carries a pin. The front gear has a slot. The pin from one gear rides in the slot of the other. Because the axes are not aligned, as the pair rotates, the pin slides back and forth in the slot, making the driven gear speed up and slow down within each revolution, even though the driving gear turns steadily. The variation is not arbitrary. The offset was chosen so that the speeding and slowing precisely match the moon's true motion. And there is more. The direction of the moon's fastest motion itself drifts around the zodiac over a period of about 9 years, because the moon's elliptical orbit slowly rotates. The designers knew this too. So they mounted the entire pin and slot assembly on a larger turntable gear that slowly carries it around, rotating the axis of the anomaly at exactly the right rate. To achieve that rate, they needed the gear ratio of the 9-year cycle, and that is why the great gear has 223 teeth doing double duty in the train. When Tony Freeth and his colleagues worked out this arrangement from the CT scans, they realized they were looking at a mechanical implementation of cutting-edge 2nd century theoretical astronomy. This is not a simple gadget. This is mathematical physics cast in bronze more than 2,000 years ago. And the planets? The inscriptions leave little doubt. The front plate text, recovered from the CT scans, speaks of the planets and their cycles. It mentions the little spheres that displayed them. The cover inscription describes the cosmos display. Most researchers now believe the front of the mechanism carried a full planetary display, with pointers or a system of rings showing Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, along with the Sun and Moon. In 2021, a team at University College London, led by Freeth, published a comprehensive reconstruction of the front display, a nested system of rings showing the whole ancient cosmos, driven by an ingenious compact gear system. The inscriptions even record the planetary period relations the designers used. For Venus, a cycle of 462 years. For Saturn, 442 years. These particular numbers were a surprise because they are more accurate than the standard Babylonian periods, suggesting Greek astronomers had refined them and hinting at lost theoretical work we know nothing else about. Why does the planetary display matter so much? Because the planets were the hardest problem in ancient astronomy. The word planet comes from the Greek for wanderer. Unlike the stars, which wheel overhead in fixed patterns, the planets drift through the zodiac on strange, looping paths. Mars, most dramatically, will travel eastward for months, then stop, reverse, travel westward in what we call retrograde motion, stop again, and resume its eastward course. We now know this is a perspective effect that occurs as Earth overtakes Mars in its orbit. But for the ancients, who placed Earth at the center of everything, retrograde motion was a profound puzzle. Greek astronomers solved it geometrically with epicycles, circles riding on circles. A planet moves around a small circle, the epicycle, while the center of that circle moves around the Earth on a larger circle. Combine the two motions and you reproduce the loops. And here is the beautiful thing. An epicycle is naturally modeled by a gear riding on another gear. The pin and slot device is an epicyclic theory made physical. The Antikythera Mechanism is Greek geometric astronomy, translated directly into machinery. It is a bronze model of a mathematical universe. So who built it, and when? Let us follow the evidence. Start with the shipwreck itself. The coins recovered from the wreck and later excavations, silver coins from Pergamon and bronze coins from Ephesus, date the ship's final voyage to somewhere around 70 to 60 years before our era. The amphorae and pottery agree. The ship was a large merchant vessel, perhaps 300 tons, sailing westward from the Aegean toward Rome. Its cargo of statues and luxury goods fits the historical moment perfectly. Rome had recently conquered the Greek East. Roman generals and wealthy elites were shipping Greek art home by the boatload, some of it looted, some of it purchased, all of it feeding an insatiable Roman appetite for Greek culture. Somewhere off Antikythera, in the treacherous channel where storms funnel between the Aegean and the open Mediterranean, the ship went down with everything aboard. The mechanism itself is older than the wreck, though how much older is debated. The letter forms of the inscriptions suggest engraving sometime between roughly 150 and 100 years before our era. Some researchers have argued, from the eclipse records built into the Solla style, that its astronomical starting point corresponds to around 200 years before our era. The machine may have been decades old when it was lost, perhaps an heirloom, perhaps a prized instrument being transported to a new owner in Italy. Now the question everyone asks, could it have been Archimedes? The greatest engineer of antiquity, the legendary mathematician of Syracuse? Here the ancient texts give us something tantalizing. The Roman statesman Cicero, writing in the 1st century before our era, within a generation of the shipwreck, describes devices exactly like this. In one work, he tells how the Roman general Marcellus, after capturing Syracuse in 212 before our era, the siege in which Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier, took just one piece of plunder for himself: a sphere, a device built by Archimedes that modeled the motions of the sun, the moon, and the 5 planets. Cicero writes that the philosopher Gaius Sulpicius Gallus demonstrated this very device, and he marvels that Archimedes' genius could make gears reproduce the unequal speeds of the heavenly bodies. In another passage, Cicero mentions that his own teacher and friend, the Stoic philosopher Posidonius, who lived on the island of Rhodes, had recently constructed a sphere that displayed the motions of the sun, moon, and planets. So we have direct ancient testimony that such machines existed, that Archimedes built one, and that another was built on Rhodes in exactly the era of our shipwreck. For a long time, Rhodes was the favorite candidate for the mechanism's birthplace. The reasoning was compelling. Rhodes was the center of Greek astronomy. Hipparchus, whose lunar theory is built into the mechanism's gears, worked on Rhodes. Posidonius ran his school there. The ship may well have called at Rhodes on its final voyage. It all fits beautifully. But then came the month names. When the research project read the Metonic dial and found Corinthian month names, the picture became complicated. Why would a machine made on Rhodes use the calendar of Corinth? The Corinthian calendar family was used in Corinth itself, and in its colonies, including Syracuse and Sicily, the city of Archimedes. Some researchers proposed a romantic possibility. Perhaps the mechanism belongs to a tradition founded by Archimedes himself, a lineage of craftsmanship descending from his workshop in Syracuse, preserving the calendar of his city. Archimedes did not build this particular machine. He died more than a century before it was made. But he may have built its ancestors and written the book that taught others how. Ancient sources tell us Archimedes wrote a treatise on sphere making. The book is lost. Every copy, gone. It may have been the founding text of this entire technology. Other scholars counter that Epirus in northwestern Greece also used Corinthian-type month names, and some have connected the eclipse data to latitudes in that region. Still others point out that the astronomical events recorded work well for Rhodes. The honest answer is that we do not know where the mechanism was made. Syracuse, Rhodes, Corinth, Pergamon, Alexandria all have their advocates. What we do know is more important. This machine was not a lone miracle. Its design is too assured, too refined, too mature. The gear teeth are cut with confidence. The layout is compact and economical, like the product of generations of refinement. Nobody builds a device of 30 interlocking gears as a first attempt. The Antikythera Mechanism is the sole survivor of what must have been a whole tradition of geared astronomical machines, a tradition whose other products, and whose textbooks, and whose workshops have vanished utterly. And that raises the question that haunts this entire story. Why did it vanish? Why did humanity build this and then apparently forget how for 1,000 years? Part of the answer is brutally material. Bronze was precious. A broken or obsolete bronze instrument was not thrown away. It was melted down, recycled into coins, statues, weapons, tools. Almost all the bronze statues of antiquity, and there were tens of thousands, are gone for the same reason. The great bronzes we possess today, the ones in our museums, survived mostly because they were lost, in shipwrecks or buried under disasters, beyond the reach of the recyclers. The sea that destroyed the Antikythera ship is the only reason its mechanism exists. Think about the irony. The only such machine to survive is the one that sank. Every mechanism that safely reached its destination was eventually destroyed by the very civilization that treasured it. Part of the answer is social. These machines were almost certainly rare, expensive, elite objects, made by a small number of master craftsmen for wealthy patrons, philosophers, and courts. Knowledge like this lived in a handful of workshops and a handful of manuscripts. It would not take much to break the chain. A war, a fire, a generation of apprentices who never appeared. The ancient world had no printing press. Every book was copied by hand, and a text that stopped being copied died. Archimedes' treatise on sphere making stopped being copied. The chain broke. And part of the answer is the great turning of history itself. The centuries after the mechanism sank brought the Roman civil wars, then the long imperial peace, then crisis, plague, economic contraction, and the slow fragmentation of the Mediterranean world. Scientific astronomy contracted into fewer and fewer centers. The library culture of Alexandria decayed. By the time the Western Roman Empire dissolved, the intellectual infrastructure that could sustain a technology like this had thinned to a thread. But here is the crucial point, and I want to be precise, because this is where the story is often told wrong. The knowledge did not vanish completely. The thread, thin as it was, never fully broke. In the 6th century of our era, in the Byzantine world, someone built a geared sundial calendar, a portable device with a handful of gears showing the day of the month and the phase of the moon. It survives, in fragments, in the Science Museum in London, and Michael Wright himself studied it. It is crude compared to the Antikythera Mechanism, a distant echo, but it proves the tradition of astronomical gearing still flickered 500 years after the shipwreck. Then the flame passed to the Islamic world. Around the year 1000, the great Persian scholar al-Biruni described a geared calendar instrument, the box of the moon, showing the moon's phase and the calendar with a train of gears. A geared astrolabe, made by Muhammad ibn Abi Bakr of Isfahan in the 13th century, survives today in Oxford, and its gearing follows the same mathematical family as the ancient devices. Islamic engineers like al-Jazari built elaborate water clocks with automata, keeping the culture of fine mechanism alive. And from the Islamic world, through Spain and the Crusader contacts and the translation movement, the knowledge flowed into medieval Europe. When the mechanical clock appeared in Europe at the end of the 13th century, it did not appear from nothing. And almost immediately, European clockmakers reached beyond timekeeping, toward the old dream. In the early 14th century, Richard of Wallingford, abbot of St. Albans, built a great astronomical clock showing the moon and eclipses. A few decades later, Giovanni de Dondi of Padua spent 16 years building his astrarium, a magnificent machine with 7 dials showing the sun, the moon, and all 5 planets, complete with elliptical gears to model their varying speeds. De Dondi's machine is, in spirit, the direct descendant of the Antikythera Mechanism, separated from it by 14 centuries. The dream had survived. It had simply slept. Still, we must sit with the astonishing fact. Nothing as mechanically sophisticated as the Antikythera Mechanism, nothing with its density of gearing and its theoretical depth, appears in the surviving record for well over 1,000 years after it sank. When historians say it was 1,000 years ahead of its time, This is what they mean, and it is not hype. If you had shown the mechanism to the finest craftsmen of Charlemagne's Europe, they could not have copied it. The lathes, the files, the gear-cutting knowledge, the astronomical theory, all of it would need to be rebuilt from scratch. Technology, we like to believe, moves only forward. The Antikythera Mechanism is the great counterexample. Progress is not a law of nature. It is a chain of human hands, and chains can break. Let me tell you now about the physical object itself, because the details of its manufacture are their own kind of wonder. The mechanism survives in 82 fragments. The largest, fragment A, contains the main gear train, 27 gears packed into a space a few centimeters thick. The gears were cut from bronze sheet only a millimeter or two thick, an alloy of copper and tin. The teeth are small triangles, cut by hand with a file, hundreds and hundreds of them. The tooth counts range from tiny gears with 15 teeth to the great wheel with 223. Making such gears by hand, accurately enough that trains of them mesh and run without jamming, requires extraordinary skill. The maker laid out the teeth with compass and dividers, marking out prime numbers of teeth, 53, 127, 223, numbers you cannot reach by simple halving and quartering of a circle. Dividing a circle into 223 equal parts with hand tools is a feat that would challenge an instrument maker in any century. One of the gears needed 53 teeth, an awkward prime, purely because the mathematics of the lunar anomaly demanded it. The designer did not simplify the astronomy to make the manufacturing easier. He made the manufacturing serve the mathematics. And the inscriptions, thousands of characters, were engraved with letters sometimes just 1.5 millimeters tall. Whoever made this had the hands of a master jeweler and the mind of a mathematician. Or the two worked side by side. The machine also shows something profoundly human. It has imperfections. Researchers studying the gear teeth have found small irregularities in their spacing, the natural signature of handwork. Some scholars have even argued the triangular tooth profile would have made the motion slightly jerky, with errors accumulating through the long gear trains, meaning the planetary predictions could drift noticeably. In other words, it may not have been a precision observatory instrument. It may have been something else. A demonstration. A teaching device. A statement. Perhaps its deepest purpose was not to generate numbers, but to make an argument that the cosmos is rational, that the wandering of the planets and the terror of eclipses are not the whims of gods, but the workings of geometry, and that the human mind can hold that geometry and even build it in bronze small enough to carry. In a Greek philosophical school, imagine the moment. The teacher turns the handle. The heavens revolve on the table. The students watch the moon wax and wane. Watch the pointer find the next eclipse. The lesson is unforgettable. The universe is a mechanism, and it can be known. The story of the wreck itself was not over either. In 1976, the legendary ocean explorer Jacques Cousteau brought his ship Calypso to Antikythera. With the blessing of the Greek government, his divers excavated part of the site with modern methods. They recovered hundreds of objects: coins, jewelry, pottery, small bronzes, and human remains. The bones of people who went down with the ship. The coins were decisive for dating. But even Cousteau's team, with their aqualungs, could spend only limited time at that depth. Then, beginning in 2012, Archaeology returned to Antikythera with 21st century technology. The Return to Antikythera project, a collaboration between the Greek authorities and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, with archaeologist Brendan Foley among the leaders, surveyed the site with rebreathers, robotic vehicles, and a remarkable one-person submersible suit called the exosuit, which lets a diver work at depth like a wearable submarine. The new expeditions mapped the wreck site precisely, found that the debris field is large, consistent with a great ship, and recovered new treasures. Bronze fittings, a magnificent bronze arm in 2017, suggesting more statues still lie buried, part of a bronze statue base, and hints that as many as 7 or more bronze statues may remain under the sand and boulders. In 2016 came the most poignant find, a human skeleton buried under half a meter of sediment, remarkably preserved. The researchers nicknamed him Pamphilos, after a name found scratched on a wine cup from the wreck. Bones 2,000 years old, of a young man who drowned when the ship went down, perhaps trapped below decks in the storm. Scientists hope to recover DNA from the skull's dense bone to learn where he came from, this anonymous witness to the catastrophe that preserved the mechanism for us. And of course, everyone involved in the project dreams the great dream, that somewhere under those boulders lies another fragment of the mechanism, perhaps the missing pieces of the planetary gearing. Roughly a third of the machine survives. 2/3 of it is still missing, either dissolved into the sea or lying, just possibly, beneath the sand of that slope, waiting. Meanwhile, the mechanism has inspired a small worldwide community of builders. Michael Wright's brass reconstruction was only the first. Researchers and craftsmen have built working models in metal, in wood, even in Lego. A famous Lego reconstruction actually computes eclipses with plastic gears. Watchmakers have created wristwatches inspired by its gearing. Hublot made a miniature tribute small enough to wear. Students X-ray it, engineers simulate it, and every few years, a new paper refines some detail of the gearing or reads a few more letters of the inscriptions. The little bronze machine from the bottom of the sea has become one of the most intensively studied artifacts on Earth, examined with more advanced technology than almost any other object from antiquity. There is something fitting in that. We aim our most advanced machines at their most advanced machine, and across 2,000 years, one engineering culture salutes another. Let me also clear away, honestly, the fog of pseudoscience that sometimes surrounds this object, because the mechanism deserves better than myths. You will find claims online that the mechanism proves ancient astronauts, or lost super civilizations, or time travel. It proves none of these things, and it needs none of them. Every function of the mechanism corresponds exactly to the documented astronomy of its own era. The Metonic cycle, the Saros cycle, Hipparchus's lunar theory, Babylonian planetary periods, all of it is attested in ancient texts and clay tablets. The mechanism contains nothing the Greeks did not know. That is precisely what makes it so important. It is not an anomaly from outside history. It is the authentic voice of ancient science, telling us that our estimate of ancient capability was too low. The mystery is not where the knowledge came from. We know where it came from. Centuries of Babylonian observation fused with Greek geometry. The mystery is how much else was achieved that we will never see, because it rotted, burned, or went into the melting pot. The mechanism is a floodlight aimed at our own ignorance of the past. For every ancient book that survived, many were lost. We possess, by some estimates, only a small fraction of classical literature. If a single shipwreck can rewrite the history of technology, what else is missing from our picture of the ancient world? What did we lose in the fires of Alexandria's libraries, in the sack of cities, in the silent non-copying of unfashionable manuscripts? The Antikythera Mechanism forces us to hold that question open. Consider, too, what this story teaches about how science itself works. For half a century after its discovery, the mechanism was nearly ignored, because it contradicted what everyone knew. The evidence sat in the museum case, while the textbooks stayed wrong. It took outsiders and obsessives, a physicist turned historian, a museum curator working nights in his home workshop, a filmmaker with a mathematics degree, to take the anomaly seriously. And it took technology, radiography, tomography, computational imaging, each generation of tools revealing what the previous one could not. The mechanism was discovered not once, but many times. In 1900 by divers, in 1902 by Stais, in the 50s by Price, in the 90s by Wright, in 2005 by the Research Project, and it is still being discovered now, as scholars squeeze meaning from the last faint letters in the corrosion. Truth in science is not a lightning bolt. It is a long excavation. And consider the chain of unlikely events that brought this knowledge to you, listening now. A craftsman in some Greek workshop cuts 223 teeth into a bronze wheel. The machine passes to an owner wealthy enough to ship it toward Rome. A storm rises off a rocky island, and the ship, which sailed 1,000 miles safely, sinks within sight of shore. The bronze lies in darkness, while empires rise and fall above it. Rome, Byzantium, the Ottomans. Then another storm, 2,000 years later, pushes a boat of sponge divers to shelter at that exact island. A diver lands on that exact slope. An archaeologist notices a gear in a broken lump that everyone else ignored. A physicist refuses to let the puzzle go. Engineers ship an 8-ton scanner across Europe to X-ray corroded fragments. Any link in this chain fails, and the Antikythera mechanism does not exist for us. We would still believe complex gearing began in medieval Europe. Our entire picture of ancient science would be poorer, and we would not even know it. How much of history hangs on chains like this? How much has already slipped through? So let us end where we began, on the seafloor off that rocky island. But now, with understanding. The heap of corpses that terrified a sponge diver was a cargo of art. The lump of bronze that scholars dismissed was the most sophisticated machine of the ancient world. Inside it, gears still hold the mathematics of the heavens, the 19 years of Meton, the 223 months of the Saros, the subtle wobble of the moon that Hipparchus tamed with geometry. It was built by people whose names we will probably never know, in a workshop we cannot locate, following a tradition that may descend from Archimedes himself, and it is the only one of its kind that survived, saved by the very disaster that drowned it. The Antikythera mechanism tells us two things, and both are worth carrying with you. The first is about the past. The ancients were not primitive versions of us. They were us, fully, with minds as sharp and hands as skilled, working with what their world provided. Given centuries of eclipse records and the geometry of circles, they built a computer. Never underestimate the people who came before you. The second is about the future, and it is more sobering. Knowledge is not permanent. Civilizations can reach astonishing heights and then lose what they achieved. Not through cataclysm necessarily, but through neglect, through broken chains of teachers and students, through the slow silence of books no one copies. What survived of the ancient world's greatest machine was decided by chance, by a storm and a slope and a diver's landing spot. What survives of our own knowledge 1,000 years from now will be decided by choices we are making today, by what we preserve, what we teach, and what we bother to write down. Somewhere beneath the waters off Antikythera, under sand and fallen boulders, the missing 2/3 of the mechanism may still be waiting. And somewhere in the unexcavated earth of the Mediterranean world, other machines, other books, other proofs of ancient genius may be waiting too. The story is not finished. The sea kept this secret for 2,000 years and gave it back. We should wonder, with humility and with hope, what else it is still keeping. Thank you for spending this hour with the strangest and most beautiful machine of the ancient world. If this story moved you, share it, because stories, like knowledge, survive only when they are passed from hand to hand. Until next time, keep looking closer at the things everyone else ignores. Sometimes, a lump of corroded bronze holds a universe.